because I mean some stuff because it's all so interesting. He was named one of the super lawyers, and that's a rating service of outstanding lawyers who have attained a high degree of peer recognition and professional achievement. On many websites, he's listed as a civil rights and plaintiffs lawyer, and he's done a lot of work that we've even had things dealing with in the past, like on this Superfund cleanup and some of that pollution and bribes and duplicity. I read some comments that Jack said online. He's dealt with mental health issues, and I know Judy is interested in that, and Catherine and Jackie are on the Superfund cleanup. I think we had um, a connect a few months ago about that very topic. But today we asked him to talk about mass incarceration, and he's had some experience with improving conditions in the prisons and lawsuits there. Also with economic opportunities for African Americans in the Alabama Black Belt. So he has a wealth of experiences that we can go one by one and talk about for the next 4 or 5 connects. He knows and has worked with Michelle Alexander of the book The New Jim Crow. He's closely connected with Danny Carr, who's the Jefferson County prosecutor. Brian Stevenson, he's met with Just Mercy. So there's a wealth of experiences there, but I won't drag it on. And I just, it's a very much pleasure to introduce Jack Drake.
Well, thank you very much. As Dr. Nelson said, when I got out of law school, I went to work for the Selma Project, which is a civil rights organization, and did a good bit of work in the Black Belt, the Freedom Quilting Bee and other things you may have heard of. But I was, of course, also a lawyer, and so I began to do constitutional and civil rights work all over the state of Alabama. And one of the first cases that my firm became involved in was prison litigation in Alabama. And from that, we also became involved in litigation involving jails. For example, my partner, Ralph Knowles, and I brought what was called a conditions case against the Tuscaloosa County Jail. And I was also involved in the Jefferson County Jail case. And these things happened mostly in the 70s, but extended on into at least the mid 1980s. And I won't overwhelm you with a lot of statistics because this is an issue that mass incarceration, that there are a lot of numbers floating around, but I will mention some of the sources of that information, just in case you might have some interest in looking. Michelle Alexander wrote the book The New Jim Crow. It was published in 2010. There's a brand new edition out in paperback that has a 20-page introduction or preface to it that kind of brings the book up to date. It's very useful. There's something called the Vera Institute, that's VERA, that is a Manhattan think tank that is committed solely to the question of justice reform and institutional reform, and it has an enormous it's an enormous source of resources. They have a easy to use website. The Bureau of Justice Statistics is a division within the Department of Justice, and it publishes lots of information. And then the NAACP is also collects information and statistics and has in this area for basically its entire existence. And they have something called the Criminal Justice Fact Sheet, which is easy to find right on that website. If you Google that name, you'll go right to it. and it has summaries of all of the relevant statistics about incarceration in the United States. But basically, what happened in this country, as we all know, is that uh, because of kind of mass fear of crime and mass fear, particularly in the white community, but also I think in the black community as well, about drug addiction and drug related crimes. We just had this entire series of statutes and regulations and changes in the law that were made that resulted in a 30-year period of increasing our prison population in the United States 5 times. We had a five-fold increase from 1978 to 2008. It peaked in 2008 with 2.3 million people in prison. And I'm sure all of you have heard that the United States has 5% of the world's population, but we incarcerate 25% of all of the people who are in prison all over the entire world. And that is a staggering figure, I think. Roughly 60% of the people who are incarcerated nationwide are people of color. The incarceration rates for uh, children and adults both are much, much higher for African Americans than for whites. And in the United States, African American children represent 32% of children who are arrested, 42% of children who are detained in some way. That would include some juvenile detention, and 52% of children who are prosecuted as adults in the United States are African Americans. There's no question that racism has driven the whole issue of mass incarceration, and we see that through sentencing. We see it through simple decisions about where do you send the police. You see it in policies. If you watched the Democratic debate last night, such as stop and frisk that Mike Bloomberg had in New York, or before him, Rudy Giuliani, who had the zero tolerance policing, which has led to much of this problem, in my opinion, when you have police officers who are what are called in the business sworn officers, that is, people who have a gun and a badge and the right to arrest people, and they're riding around in cars stopping people because they have a tag light burnt out on their rear tag, or one of their tail lights is burned out. That's not, in my opinion, the highest and best use of law enforcement. But one thing it sure does is it leads to lots of arrests and lots of tickets being written. And we also know part of this problem, it results in a lot of revenue for cities, whether that city's in Missouri or it's in Alabama, Alabama in particular. So that's sort of just a real quick overview of what the problem is. It has been declining. The total number of people in prison has been declining since 2008. It's down to about 1.7 million people incarcerated in the United States as of the end of 2018, which is the last time for which there are data. But we still have a massive number of people who are locked up in this country. And I thought I would talk a minute about my own ideas about what caused this to happen. And if you look at the justice system from the very beginning to the end, everything about that system in the last 50 years really has been designed to arrest large numbers of people, prosecute them, and put them in prison. And many of the things that they are arrested for and prosecuted for either ought not be crimes, in my opinion, or ought to be some sort of new way of thinking about it, maybe call it a civil offense or something, a civil infraction where people uh, have to pay a fine or have to go into some sort of counseling or have some intervention that's more out of the field of social work than it is out of the field of criminal law. We have a district attorney in Jefferson County now who's the first African American district attorney, and we also have the first African American sheriff. And they got together very quickly after they were elected uh, in 2018 and said, we want to legalize marijuana because it's just a problem that it's a social problem, but it ought not be treated criminally. And in the interim, we would like to stop arresting people for possession of marijuana and give them a ticket so that they can just pay a small fine like they would if they were speeding or something like that. And there was so much reaction against that and so much pushback that that has not happened. And the pushback came from the Attorney General, the governor, and mayors in all these little towns we have in Jefferson County. And again, a lot of it has to do with money. When a police officer in Fultondale, which is just north of Birmingham, arrests somebody for possession of marijuana, uh, that person has to make a bond. That he receives a bond fee from the bail bond of $500 or $1,000. And then there's a fine, and then there's court costs. And some of the cities in Alabama are literally financing their little court system and at least a part of their municipal operating costs out of their municipal court system. You know, some of you may have read the publicity out of Montgomery 3 or 4 years ago where they were sued by the Southern Poverty Law Center and put under an injunction and had to stop putting people in jail for failing to pay their fines. And that received a lot of attention. But my daughter, who's a lawyer in Tuscaloosa, tells me that in Tuscaloosa, people are not being put in jail for not paying their fines, but if they don't come to court to pay the fine, then they arrest them for failure to appear and put them in jail until they pay off their fines. There's just a little subtle difference there, not really much of one. So how we got there is a complicated matter that includes the entire criminal justice system, from the way we make arrests to the way we prosecute to the sentences that we seek. And then, of course, you have prisons that are not designed to do anything other than house people. And then they come out of prison with no backup support. And I've decided that I think that the one of the major problems arising out of all of this mass incarceration is the need for massive funding for social programs. You know, we've never in this country, in my opinion, made a commitment to adequately funding social service, social welfare programs that help people who are in need, including children. I mean, if you have a juvenile probation department the way a lot of counties and cities do. You have 3 people in there and the caseload is 90 people each. Not a whole lot gets done. We've never adequately funded that kind of thing. And then the public school system in Alabama, anyway, and I don't know about everywhere else, we've cut back on all kinds of school counseling positions, school nurses. We're just running a really bare bones sort of a budget for those kind of programs. And if we are serious about rehabilitating people, making them, not make them, but help them become better people, help them become successful people in some way when they come out of prison, we have to pay for it. And there's virtually nothing being done in that regard in most states in the country right now. Um, Finally, and I'm sorry I've talked so long, but I try to give some thought to what do we do about this and to reform the situation where we have more people in prison than any other country in the world. What do we do about that? And I looked for some other states to see what kind of data they have and what kind of programs they have. And I looked at Massachusetts, and I think that we could learn an awful lot from them because they have had a series of reforms beginning in 2012 and culminating in a really comprehensive statute in 2018 that is a criminal justice overhaul that addresses every aspect of what happens in the criminal justice system, from arrest to the whole bail system, which is something I haven't mentioned at all, but is certainly discriminatory against people who don't have the money to pay the bail, and who, when somebody's arrested and they're simply charged, they haven't been convicted of anything, but a lot of people in that situation stay in jail because they can't make bail. So Massachusetts has had a huge series of reforms that have removed some things from the criminal code altogether, some offenses, and have changed the sentencing guidelines about what kind of sentences are appropriate for certain offenses. They didn't change everything because obviously nobody wants dangerous criminals to be treated in a way that they just go out and commit other violent crimes. That's not what I'm talking about at all. I'm talking about people who are nonviolent offenders who there's at least some chance of helping them become different people, different from what they've been in the past. But as a result of what Massachusetts has done, and also really it probably long before 2012, in Alabama, we have 26,000 people who are incarcerated in prisons, and that's as of the end of 2018. Massachusetts, which is a much, much bigger state than Alabama, probably has 3 or 4 times the population, has 8,600 people in prison. It's a dramatic, dramatic difference. They have a third of our prison population of people who are incarcerated in Massachusetts. But, so there are things that can be done that we know that work, and Alabama is not that different from any other state in the country. In fact, we probably are better, certainly, than Texas, which likes to put everybody in prison practically. I mean, Texas has a really very, very high prison population, and the prison populations in most states and in the federal system have been declining for the last 8 years, well, 7 years, and but not in Texas. It has not declined at all, and also not in Indiana, which surprised me a little bit. But anyway, those are basically the things I wanted to mention, and certainly we can discuss what I said.
I read somewhere that Alabama, I mean, they were trying to tout it as a bright spot in the sense that they incarcerate blacks and whites in a sort of equal way, whereas other states, like Texas, as you mentioned, don't do that as much. Is there any merit to that?
I don't think so. I mean, they certainly are in the same physical buildings, blacks and whites, but the statistics as far as race go mimic the national.
Yeah, I thought so.
Yeah, I mean, the institutions in Alabama, are under court order from the Middle District of Alabama, and they also have the Justice Department has sent a lengthy written notice demanding that changes be made, or the Justice Department will move to take over the Alabama prison system. That hasn't happened yet, but it's certainly a very real threat. I had people from the Southern Poverty Law Center here this morning talking to me about a case that I filed 50 years ago, and it relates to something that they're doing now. But, they've been involved in the several different lawsuits against the state prison system and also against various municipal court systems too, for the kind of problems that I've mentioned.
I'll just mention that I took everybody off mute, so if you want to mute yourself, feel free, but I had muted folks while we were recording, so thank you, Jack.
Oh, and I forgot to remind you to record it, but you did remember. Oh, no, I'm sorry.
Have you heard of CURE? It's a group in Washington for prison reform. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I could.
Not looking at the camera, Albert.
Oh, sorry.
There you go.
Yeah, CURE.
I don't know the organization. No.
Okay. Well, just they're working for prison reform. I just happen to know it because my one of my high school teachers from John Carroll heads it up. So, and it looks like they're trying to do some good things. So you guys just look at it and see what you think of it. CURE.
Yeah.
And
who is it that was from John Carroll High School?
Charlie Sullivan. Sullivan.
Yeah.
Charlie Sullivan. And I just sort of got reacquainted with him a few years ago from that. And just briefly, what you said, I can see a little bit from personal experience because my wife has done some mentoring at the local jail with Murray County. And she got me kind of involved, reluctantly. And there's a couple of things astonishing, just as you said, the rate of incarceration just in this jail, I calculated it's about 1 out every 200 people in this county is in jail right now at this present moment.
Yeah.
And also you touched a little bit on the bail thing. I know one of my wife's mentorees was in the jail for 2 years without trial, and supposedly was being held for a murder case. And she never went to trial. They never proved it because they found other ways to put pressure on her to make a deal.
Yeah.
2 years. And then I thought, well, that's just unusual. But when I went there and started talking to people, you have a group and there's just about half of them were sitting in there for not for a month or two, but sometimes for a year without going to trial.
Yeah, that's a common problem.
Yeah.
Very common.
Very just ridiculous, really. I mean, it seems like it's unconstitutional, isn't it? Really?
Yes, yes. I think there's a whole range of things about this that are subject to constitutional challenge, and many of them have been challenged. And the bail system is being reformed, or at least there are discussions about reforming it all over the country. And it is a significant problem, particularly among poor people.
Well, it seems, and I'll just quit talking a little bit, but it seems like we at least supposedly have a reform-minded governor. Bill Lee just came in, and he was doing some prison reform as a private citizen before he became governor. So hopefully, something good.
Is he the son of J.D. Lee?
How's that?
Is he the son of J.D. Lee?
I don't know. I really don't know.
Yeah, J.D. Lee was a famous lawyer in Tennessee, and he ran for governor in Tennessee and lost back in the 80s. I bet he is.
I don't. Might be, but and hopefully, some things will come out of it. But
yeah.
And just very briefly, like you say, when they get out, the system doesn't help them either. I know there's one guy that I was working with. He got out, and it just seemed like the system really conspired to make it difficult for him rather than helping him.
Yeah.
Some of the so-called well-intended things, like suppose there's these classes on anger management you're supposed to take. Well, they schedule them. First of all, he had to take them.
Yeah.
Part of his parole, and they scheduled it so that it made him difficult for him to keep his job, because you will be there at 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
Yeah.
No exception. So he had to take time off of work, and already it's not easy for a parolee to find something and then just say, oh, well, I got to be gone for 2 hours down to do this thing.
Yeah, that reminds me of something that I didn't feel like I had time to talk about, but we have two systems of justice in Alabama and in much of the country, where people who can pay for various things are treated one way, and those who can't pay are treated completely differently.
Yep.
For example, we've all heard about drug courts and diversion programs for, say, veterans. There's a veterans court in Alabama as well as a drug court. Well, people have to pay to participate in that.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have the fee, you can't be in the program. And then every time you go to court to report and answer questions from the judge or from a caseworker, you have to get a urine test to show that you're drug free. Well, the urine test costs money.
Yeah.
And all of these programs are financed by the participants. And that's really very, very discriminatory against people that are not necessarily destitute, but if you're making $300 a week or something, and somebody says, well, you have to pay $20 for this and $50 for that, sometimes you can't afford it.
Right. Find a good place, reasonable place to rent away from the environment that you're in to begin with.
Yeah.
That's true.
Mr. Drake, I know in decades past, the state system prisons have been known as in much worse condition than the federal system of prison. Yeah. What can you say about the health and food conditions when people are locked up for so long? How is that? Does it meet a minimum standard?
If it does, it's barely. One of the things that was most recently litigated in Alabama in federal court was over the lack of mental health services in the prisons. And it's kind of a dovetail kind of problem in Alabama that we have closed up our big hospitals, mental hospitals, and cut back on funding for our regional treatment centers. And lots of mentally ill people end up in prison. And there's no, almost no services for them in the state prison system in Alabama. And as a result, our suicide rate in the state prison system is very high. And that is really what was involved in this most recent case that was tried in the federal court in 2018 in Montgomery. But I think the complete answer to that is the conditions in the state prisons in Alabama are almost beyond imagination how bad they are. I mean, we're talking about buildings that are anywhere from 60 to 100 years old, and people are living in buildings that were designed for 200 people, and there are 850 in the building. And it's really been horrible. And there's been some progress, at least getting people out of there and lowering the populations, but it's still a very, very bad situation.
And Jack, there are no minimum standards that are administered nationwide for states. They set their own standards through their own state systems and protocols.
There are professional standards. You know, if you hire an expert witness on providing services for mental health, for example, for people who are in prison, you have standards that come from the American Psychiatric Association or the American Psychological Association about how many professionals you need to treat people in that kind of a setting. But no, there are no national standards that are binding on any of the states. And that's part of the problem. I mean, this is a state run system for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
The federal system is far superior, although it's not by any means pleasant, you know, and depending on which federal facility you're in, it can be really terrible. I mean, the maximum security prisons in the federal prison are serious, hard-nosed places, and they should be for the people that are in there. But even the lesser secure facilities, like the ones that politicians and office holders end up in, oftentimes, they're still prisons. You know, they still lock the doors.
Mm-hmm. And I'm remembering that Charlotte was a prison psychologist. What I don't remember was whether you worked for a state or a federal.
It was federal.
Okay.
Federal.
All right. Well, I tell you, we've got we as a country have a lot of work to do, don't we?
Yeah, there are a lot of needs in the country, particularly in this area of the criminal justice system. And I really do think the problems exist from the very beginning all the way through it. We need to rethink our entire approach to punishment in the United States. I think the Northern Europeans have a lot of models that we could learn from, but we're a long way from even doing that.
Well, Jack, you may have mentioned this to some extent, but what what good signs do you see happening either in Alabama or elsewhere? Are you seeing some progress? I know Equal Justice Initiative, as you mentioned, has been working first with individual cases and more, I guess, at the policy level, or trying to get changes systemically. But what are you seeing that gives you hope?
Well, in the area of criminal justice reform, we have a state senator, Cam Ward, who has almost single-handedly led a fight to adopt new sentencing statutes, sentencing guidelines. That's been a big progressive step and a help, a step in the right direction. And I think that the election of Danny Carr as DA in Jefferson County is a great step forward for this county. And Danny will be a voice, and already is, for change and progress within the state District Attorneys Association and other organizations like that, other law enforcement organizations. He's a highly respected prosecutor because he was a career prosecutor in the office for 25 years before he was elected. So he's in some ways a hard-nosed prosecutor, but also one who realizes that much of what we've done in the past in this country has not worked.
Jack, I had a couple of police officers in Birmingham tell me that, that their jobs are getting easier in patrolling certain neighborhoods, and that they're finding less crime. And objectively, I wanted to know if have you seen, or do you believe that there's a drop in the crime rate or a drop in arrests and pursuit of criminals?
Well, I think maybe it's been some of both, but there certainly has been a decline in the overall crime rate in Jefferson County and a decline in the murder rate too. The Birmingham News puts every single murder that happens right in front of our face, so we're constantly reminded of it. But the murder rate has actually been going down here for about 5 years, and the overall crime rate has as well. But we don't have a police chief now, also on the other side of the coin, who believes in zero tolerance policing. So I don't think the police are going around writing tickets for burnout taillights. And I know they're not doing the kind of sweeps they used to do on southwest side of Birmingham, where they take 20 police cars and cover a 10, 15, 20 square block area and write tickets for people for everything that they saw that was wrong, including expired tags on cars, cars parked in front of houses, and all sorts of things like that. I mean, that doesn't exactly endear the police to the community when they come through and there are 50 police officers going through a neighborhood writing tickets and arresting people. So I don't believe that's going on anymore.
Oh, Jack, I heard you mention Massachusetts as a model, and then later on you said that it's pretty much state organizing and enforce. It's not something, and it just appeared to me that Massachusetts is one of the more liberal states, and Alabama has a long history of abusing and manipulating, African Americans all the way. I saw the movie 13th, and it went back a long, long time to time past slavery and the 13th Amendment. So do you see any chance that other states can adopt that, or just the more liberal states?
Well, I think that, you know, I mentioned Cam Moore, the state senator who's spearheaded a lot of the reforms in Alabama. He's got a very good argument that he's been using with conservative members of the legislature, and that is what we're doing is not working.
Yeah.
And it's a never-ending process. It's extremely expensive. We have all these people in prison that we have to feed and clothe and take care of. And there are better ways of doing this. So he's approached it as a real pragmatic standpoint, not so much an ideological standpoint. And I think that argument has a lot of appeal to all kinds of folks. I mean, there's not much dispute that what we've been doing has not worked.
I agree. It's simply not smart. It's not getting anyone's needs met. You know,
Yeah.
you're putting criminals in deteriorating situations where they come out worse, if not diseased or unhealthy, and becoming other kinds of burdens. So just not smart.
Well, unless there are people benefiting because of the money. I mean, what is the situation, Jack, in Alabama? Are they private prisons? I don't even know that.
No, we don't have any private prisons. We have contracted out services in the prisons, like medical care, food service, and so forth. But
Which is very lucrative.
yes, it is. The Corrections Corporation of America is not running any of the prisons in Alabama yet, but I'm sure they would like to be. And there's a big issue here too of building new prisons to replace the old buildings. And the proposal there is to allow one of these private corporations, maybe not necessarily the Correction Corporation of America, but others, to come in and build the prisons and then lease them to the state of Alabama. They wouldn't be running them, but that's just a step away from, I think, from actually running the things and having the state pay a leasing fee and also a management fee. So that might happen here. I don't know.
And historically, as well as currently, there's low-cost prison labor.
Yes, I
At
don't
least
know how much of that is going on now, but there has been in the past.
it's been a big thing in California,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah, they don't, the minimum wage law doesn't apply, so people can be paid for piecework rates or 20 cents an hour or whatever, and depends on what they're doing, but there's not any of that going on in Alabama that I know about.
That's good.
I'll say this, and maybe it'll be the end of it, end of the discussion, because I think we are close to running out of time. But in the 1970s, we were involved, my law firm, along with other people, of suing the state prison system in Alabama for the first time. And we had Judge Frank Johnson on the bench who had the case, and we got sweeping orders and all sorts of standards about what had to be done. And literally we thought by about 1980 that we had solved the problem. Little did we know that we had not. So the problem is much worse today than it was in 1980.
So I just always think during election year that of the link between mass incarceration and voter suppression. I know one election year I was out canvassing in Virginia and approached a person and asked if he had registered to vote, and he said no, he couldn't. He was a former felon. And I said, what? I mean, it just, I didn't see any relationship between, and I had never known that felons lose their right to vote. There's no reason that that right has to be a right that's taken away because you're imprisoned and then remain with you for the rest of your life. So I know some geographic areas are really working to correct that, but what do you see, Jack, as that was that part of the impetus as well at getting more people into prison?
Historically, I don't think there's any question about it because the statutes that took away the right to vote for people who committed felonies and or crimes of moral turpitude, which include some misdemeanors, were adopted at the same time as the Jim Crow laws. In Alabama, that would be in the Constitution of 1901 and the statutes that were adopted over about the next 10 years after that. So there's no question there's that historical link to it. And there's a lot of effort going on to reform that, and we just got a small step in that direction in Alabama through a statute that was passed in, I think, 2018 that removes a lot of those crimes from the ones that disqualified people from voting. So we still have a good many of them. And it's a problem. It's a nationwide problem.
Well, I want to acknowledge you for being a powerful influence and very dedicated and committed for all these years. It's a horrible, horrible reality that I think as we grow older, we see more because we've lived with it for a long time now.
Yeah.
And I just want to commend you for what you've done.
Well, thank you.
And for sharing with us.
Thank you.
Well, thanks a whole lot, Mr. Drake. I'd like to second that thought. Really, I've learned a lot. In fact, I've got 2 or 3 pages of notes that I'm going to send to Ann in just a few minutes, summarizing what we said for the people who missed it. And we really appreciate your visiting us during this time.
Well, thank you all very much. I enjoyed it.
Thank you, Jack. And go ahead, Adrian.
I was just going to say, please do consider joining our group because
Yeah.
we need some experts.
I want to do that, and I thank you. I'm going to get off now because I'm about to lose my voice.
No, thanks a whole lot.
All righty. Thank
Thanks a lot.
you.
Thank you so much.
Jack, thanks again.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Thank you.